There is a particular kind of story that asks something different of its listener than most stories do. It does not ask for excitement or suspense, for the readiness to be surprised or the willingness to be alarmed. It asks instead for something quieter, something that requires a different kind of attention altogether. It asks you to look at a human life with patience and curiosity, to follow a mind as it moves through the world, and to resist the temptation to decide too quickly what that mind deserves. Tonight's story is one of those. It is the story of Otto Octavius, a man of extraordinary gifts who became one of the most formidable figures in the history of Marvel Comics, a scientist whose brilliance was matched only by the depth of his wounds and the distance between who he was and who he might have been. So settle in now, let your body find its ease, and allow this story to carry you gently forward. The city of Schenectady sits in upstate New York in a place where the landscape flattens out from the gentler hills to the west, and the air in winter carries a particular quality of cold that feels both clean and final, as though the season means what it says. It is a city that built itself around industry, around the hum and heat of manufacturing, around the kind of work that leaves marks on the hands and comes home in the evenings smelling of metal and machine oil. For much of the 20th century it was a city of workers, of people who understood the world through the things they made with their bodies, through the practical intelligence of those who keep complicated machinery, running through long shifts in large buildings that never entirely stop making noise. It was into this world that Otto Octavius was born sometime in the 1930s, in a household that contained within its walls all of the tensions that would eventually define the man he became. The house itself was modest in the way that working-class homes of that era were modest, not mean or bare but simply measured, containing exactly what was needed and very little that was not. There was a kitchen where most of the living happened, a front room that was reserved for visitors and therefore always slightly cold in spirit regardless of the season, and upstairs the particular silence of rooms where people slept, the heavy sleep of those who are tired in the body rather than the mind. His father's name was Octavius, and he was by most observable measures a successful man within the terms that his world offered him. He was large and physically capable, a man who moved through his environment with the ease of someone who has never doubted his right to occupy space, and he worked steadily and reliably at the kind of factory employment that formed the economic backbone of cities like Schenectady in those decades. He was not unintelligent, Torbert, but his intelligence was entirely practical, pointed outward at the material world and its problems, impatient with anything that could not be held in the hand or measured by its usefulness. He had a particular and deeply felt contempt for what he called softness, by which he meant roughly any quality of character that he associated with weakness, with over-refinement, with the kind of person who preferred books to physical work and ideas to action. It is not difficult to imagine how Otto Octavius regarded his son. Otto was small as a child, not dramatically so, but noticeably, a boy who would never be large in the way his father was large, and who showed from his earliest years a quality of intense interior absorption that made him seem, to someone like Torbert, somehow absent even when physically present. The boy was always thinking. You could see it in the way his eyes moved when he was quiet, tracking some internal process that had nothing to do with whatever was happening in the room around him. He had little interest in the physical world for its own sake, no talent for the kind of play that earns a father's approval, no instinct for roughness or competition, or the performance of toughness that passes for character in certain environments. Torbert's response to his son's nature was not cruelty in any theatrical sense. He was not the kind of father who shouts or strikes with frequency or dramatic intention. What he offered instead was something more continuous, and in many ways more damaging than occasional cruelty, a steady atmosphere of low-grade contempt, an unbroken signal that the boy was somehow insufficient, that his gifts were not real gifts, that the particular form his intelligence took was not the kind that mattered, not the kind that a man could respect. He said things in the way that people say things when they believe they are simply being honest. The boy has his head in the clouds. That kind of thinking doesn't put food on any table. A man who can't use his hands isn't much of a man, and each of these observations, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who has never been challenged on his fundamental assumptions about the world, settled into Otto's developing sense of himself like stones dropped into still water. His mother was a different matter entirely, though not necessarily a less complicated one. Mary Lavinia Octavius was a woman of considerable intelligence, who'd been born into circumstances that offered her almost nothing to do with it. She had married young, as women of her background and generation generally did, and she had transferred the whole weight of her unlived ambitions onto her only child with an intensity that was genuinely loving and genuinely suffocating in approximately equal measure. She saw in Otto everything she had not been permitted to become, and she communicated this to him constantly. Not through speeches or declarations, but through the accumulated pressure of 1,000 small daily signals. The way her face changed when he showed her a problem he had solved, the particular quality of her attention when he read to her from his science books, the absolute certainty with which she told him, regularly and without qualification, that he was exceptional, that he was destined for great things, that ordinary life with its ordinary constraints was simply not what the universe had prepared for him. The effect of these two opposing forces on a child's developing psychology is not difficult to trace, though it is worth taking a moment to sit with its full weight. On one side, a father who communicated through every available channel that his son's nature was inadequate, that his gifts were not real, that the interior world where Otto lived most fully was somehow not a legitimate place for a man to spend his time. On the other, a mother who communicated with equal force and consistency that her son was extraordinary, that ordinary standards did not apply to him, that the contempt of people like his father was simply the inevitable response of smaller minds to a larger one. A child growing up in this field of opposing pressures does not come out balanced. He comes out braced, armoured, organised around the only available resolution, which is to prove the mother right and the father wrong with such overwhelming completeness that the question is settled forever. Otto discovered mathematics early, in the way that genuinely gifted children sometimes do. Not as a subject taught in school, but as a language that the world seemed to already be speaking if you knew how to listen for it. Numbers had a quality that the social world entirely lacked. They were consistent. They behaved according to rules that could be known completely. They did not shift their meanings based on mood or power or the arbitrary hierarchies of the playground. A problem in mathematics had an answer, and that answer was correct or it was not, and no one's physical size or social confidence had any bearing on the matter. For a boy who experienced the social world as a place of permanent arbitrary disadvantage, this must have felt something close to religious. His teachers recognized the ability quickly. Teachers of that era, in schools of that kind, did not always know what to do with exceptional mathematical talent in a working-class child, but they recognized it and they fed it, however imperfectly, with harder problems and more advanced texts, and the particular form of acknowledgement that a child like Otto most needed, the confirmation from an authority external to his family that yes, the thing his mother told him about himself was true. He was different. He was capable of something beyond the ordinary. The world of ideas was his world, and his possession of it was legitimate and real. But intellectual recognition from teachers is a particular and limited kind of social nourishment, and it does not protect a child from the ecosystem of his peers. Otto's classmates perceived in him something that made them uncomfortable. Not his intelligence precisely. Children are less threatened by intelligence than adults sometimes imagine, but something in the quality of his attention, the way he looked at the world as though it were a problem to be solved, the absence in him of the easy social warmth that makes intelligence feel safe rather than unsettling. He was not bullied in any sustained or systematic way, or at least the record does not suggest that he was. But he was alone in the way that certain children are alone, surrounded by people who acknowledge his existence without quite including him in theirs, present at the social feast without quite being invited to sit down. He learned, in this environment, a particular kind of self-sufficiency that had arrogance woven through it from the beginning. Because what else do you do with the loneliness of being exceptional when no one has taught you that exceptionalism comes with obligations? And with responsibilities? With the requirement that gifts be used in service of something larger than the self? His mother had taught him that he was destined for greatness. His father had taught him that vulnerability was weakness. His peers had taught him that connection was unreliable. The synthesis of these three lessons was, perhaps, inevitable. He moved through his adolescence with the focused intensity of someone who has decided exactly what he wants and exactly how he intends to get it. His grades were outstanding. His knowledge of the physical sciences, mathematics, and chemistry deepened year by year into something that his teachers began to describe not as aptitude but as mastery. He read everything he could find, ordered books through the library system, stayed late in the school's small science room with its inadequate equipment and its smell of old chemicals and floor wax, working through problems that were years ahead of anything his curriculum required of him. And somewhere in those years of solitary study, in the quiet of rooms where he was alone with the beautiful consistency of the physical world and its laws, Otto Octavius found what would become his true home. Not Schenectady, not his family's house, not any relationship or community or belonging that the social world could offer him. His home was the laboratory, the space where the mind could work without interference, where intelligence was the only currency that mattered, where the problems were hard enough to be worthy of everything he had, and where the answers, when they came to him and no one else. The laboratory that Otto Octavius had found in his imagination during those long solitary evenings in his secondary school's modest science room became, in time, a real place, a series of real places, each one larger and better equipped than the last, each one representing another increment of distance from the household in Schenectady and the opposing forces that had shaped him there. The path from the household to those laboratories ran through university, and it was in university that Otto first experienced something he had not previously known in any sustained or meaningful way, the particular sensation of being surrounded by people who understood what he was talking about. He arrived at university in the late 1940s, a young man of 17 or 18, slight and already wearing the thick-lensed glasses that would become as much a part of his appearance as anything else about him, carrying with him the accumulated weight of his childhood and the fierce, directed energy of someone who has been waiting his entire life for the environment that could accommodate his abilities. The campus was not glamorous by any measure. Universities that accepted working-class boys from upstate New York in that era were not the ancient ivy-covered institutions of the Eastern Seaboard, but newer, more practical places, built around the sciences and engineering that post-war America needed desperately and was willing to fund with a generosity that felt almost utopian by the standards of what had come before. The physics department was housed in a building that smelled of chalk dust and solder, and the particular burnt sweet odour of equipment that ran hot, and it was populated by men, almost entirely men in those years, who moved through the corridors with the distracted forward momentum of people whose minds were always slightly ahead of their bodies, always already in the next problem, the next equation, the next experiment that might resolve the question that had been keeping them awake. Otto walked into this environment and felt, for the first time in his conscious memory, something approaching ease. Not comfort exactly, because Otto Octavius was not a man to whom comfort came easily, and university introduced its own forms of competition and hierarchy that would test his carefully constructed armour in ways he had not anticipated. But ease in the specific sense of a reduction in the constant low-level effort that social life had always required of him, the effort of translating himself into terms that other people could follow, of moderating the speed and intensity of his thinking to match the pace of those around him. Here, for the first time, he did not need to moderate. Here, the speed was expected. Here, the intensity was the minimum requirement rather than the disqualifying excess. His professors recognized within the first weeks what his secondary school teachers had recognized years earlier, that Otto's abilities placed him in a category that required different handling, harder problems, more demanding expectations, the kind of intellectual engagement that most undergraduates would not encounter until their graduate years if they encountered it at all. He was assigned readings that were not on any official syllabus. He was invited to sit in on postgraduate seminars where the discussions moved at a pace and depth that the standard curriculum could not approach. He was given, in other words, the thing he had always needed most, work that was genuinely difficult enough to require everything he had. And yet, even here, the social world presented its complications, because being exceptional among ordinary people produces one kind of loneliness, but being exceptional even among the exceptional produces another kind entirely, perhaps a more disorienting one, because it removes the consolation of believing that the right environment would finally solve the problem of belonging. Otto had carried into university the quiet certainty that once he found his people, the other minds that moved at his speed and cared about the things he cared about, everything would resolve. The isolation of his childhood would reveal itself to have been simply a matter of misplacement, a temporary condition caused by the accident of geography and circumstance, and once corrected it would cease. What he found instead was that he was still, even here, somewhat apart. Not dramatically so, not in ways that made daily life unmanageable, but in the specific way of someone whose abilities create a distance that goodwill and shared interest cannot entirely close. His fellow students respected him. Some of them admired him. Several were genuinely fond of him, in the uncomplicated way that people are fond of someone who is reliably brilliant and occasionally, in the right mood, surprisingly funny. But there was still something in Otto that held people at a slight remove, a quality of assessment in his regard that made casual intimacy feel slightly risky, as though anything you said might be quietly filed away and evaluated for its accuracy. He did not understand this, or rather he understood it intellectually without understanding it in the way that changes behaviour. He knew that people found him difficult to be close to. He had known this his whole life. What he had not developed, and what university did not teach him, was any insight into what he might do differently, any access to the part of himself where warmth and vulnerability lived, and from which genuine connection is made. His mother had given him grandiosity where other children receive unconditional love, and his father had taught him that softness was dangerous. The consequence of these two lessons was a man whose emotional life was conducted almost entirely in private, turned inward, available to no one, and increasingly, as the years passed, even somewhat inaccessible to himself. His academic progress through these years was remarkable by any standard. He moved through his undergraduate degree and into graduate study with a momentum that his department had rarely seen, publishing his first academic paper before he had completed his undergraduate work, a dense and technically demanding piece on the behaviour of radioactive isotopes under variable pressure conditions that attracted attention from researchers at institutions considerably more prestigious than his own. The paper was careful, precise, and showed a quality of experimental imagination that was distinct from mere technical competence, the ability not just to conduct experiments well, but to conceive of experiments that no one else had thought to conduct. It was during his graduate years that nuclear physics became his consuming passion. And it is worth pausing here to understand what nuclear physics meant in the late 1940s and early 1950s, what it felt like to be a young scientist entering that field at that particular moment in history. The atomic age had arrived with a force that was both literally and figuratively explosive, and in its wake, it had left behind not only devastation and political anxiety, but also an extraordinary proliferation of research into the peaceful applications of atomic energy, into the possibility that the same force that had unmade cities might also power them, heat them, cure diseases within them, transform the material conditions of human life in ways that the generation before had not been able to imagine. For a young man of Otto's disposition, this was intoxicating. Here was a field in which the problems were genuinely hard, harder than anything that had come before, and in which the stakes were genuinely high, higher than anything that the history of science had previously offered. Here was work that mattered, that was visibly and obviously connected to the largest questions about human possibility and human survival. Here was a frontier, in the truest sense of that word, a place where the maps had not yet been drawn, and where the person who drew them first would be remembered. He threw himself into this work with the totality of focus that had always been his defining characteristic, and the results were considerable. His doctoral research addressed questions of radiation containment and the behaviour of radioactive materials under conditions of manipulation, and it was in the course of this research that he began to think seriously, for the first time, about the problem that would eventually define his career. How does a scientist work safely with materials that are dangerous to the human body? How does the researcher who must handle radioactive substances protect himself from their effects, while maintaining the precision and dexterity that good experimental work requires? The answers available in that era were cumbersome and limited, remote manipulation equipment that sacrificed sensitivity for safety, heavy protective gear that impeded the fine motor control that delicate laboratory work demands. Otto's mind, always drawn to the problem of the relationship between intelligence and the physical world, between the thinking self and the material environment in which that self must operate, began to circle around the possibility of a different approach entirely. He completed his doctorate and accepted a research position, the first of several that would mark the early years of his professional career, in a period that coincided with his mother's increasing dependence on him and the complications this created. Mary Lavinia had never remarried after Talbot's death, had never seemed to consider it, having organised her entire emotional life around her son and his expected greatness. She followed Otto to wherever his work took him with a naturalness that he found simultaneously suffocating, and, if he was honest with himself, reassuring, because whatever else she was the one person in the world who had never communicated to him by word or gesture that he was anything less than extraordinary. His father's death had come during Otto's undergraduate years, a workplace accident at the factory where Talbot had spent his working life, and the emotional experience of it had been complex in ways that Otto did not have the psychological equipment to fully process. There was grief, or something that functioned like grief, a sudden awareness of absence where a presence had been, however uncomfortable that presence. There was also, wound through the grief in ways that produced guilt, a sensation that resembled relief, the permanent ending of a judgment that had shadowed every achievement of his life. Talbot would never now be proved wrong, but he would also never be proved wrong. The verdict of his father's contempt had been suspended without ever being overturned, and Otto would spend years, perhaps the rest of his life, pursuing the kind of recognition that would have constituted that overturning, seeking from the world the vindication that his father had denied him, and that death had made impossible to obtain from its original source. In his mother's increasingly dependent company, in the research laboratories where his reputation was steadily building, in the solitude of the problem he was beginning to formulate about the relationship between a scientist and his tools, Otto Octavius moved through these years carrying everything he had always carried, the gifts and the wounds inseparable, the brilliance and the brokenness wound together so thoroughly that neither could be addressed without touching the other. He was becoming, in the professional sense, exactly what his mother had always told him he would become. The private cost of that becoming was something that no one around him, and perhaps not even Otto himself, had yet begun to fully reckon with. The problem that had begun forming in Otto's mind during his doctoral years took shape slowly, the way that the best scientific ideas tend to, not as a sudden illumination, but as a gradual clarification, a progressive sharpening of focus that happens across months and years of thinking that is sometimes conscious and deliberate, and sometimes occurring in the background of other activities, present in the mind the way a low note is present in a piece of music, felt more than heard, structuring everything above it without announcing itself directly. The question, stated simply, was this: the most important work in nuclear and atomic research required direct, sensitive, precise manipulation of materials that were actively dangerous to the human beings doing the manipulating. Radiation did not discriminate between the scientist who was trying to understand it and the substance he was trying to understand. It moved through protective barriers with a patience and persistence that no engineering solution had yet fully answered. The existing approaches to this problem were all variations on the same basic strategy, which was to put distance between the researcher and the material, to interpose layers of shielding and remote handling equipment between the human body and the radioactive substance, and to accept the loss of sensitivity and precision that this distance inevitably produced. Otto found this solution philosophically unsatisfying, in a way that went beyond mere professional impatience. There was something in the logic of increasing distance that struck him as a kind of defeat, an admission that the material world was fundamentally hostile to human intelligence, that the price of safety was always a reduction in the quality of understanding. He did not accept this. He believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone whose entire sense of self rests on the proposition that his mind can master whatever problem it sets itself, that the right answer was not more distance but a different kind of proximity, a way of being close to dangerous materials that protected the human body without sacrificing the intelligence and dexterity that made close work valuable. He had arrived at the Atomic Research Centre by this point, having moved through 2 previous research positions with a combination of genuine accomplishment and interpersonal difficulty that was becoming a recognisable pattern in his professional life. He was, by the early 1950s, a man in his late 20s or early 30s, whose scientific reputation was solid and growing, whose publications were read and cited by colleagues at the most significant institutions in his field, and whose relationships with supervisors and co-workers were consistently complicated by the same quality that had always complicated his relationships: the absolute certainty of his own judgment, and the difficulty he experienced in operating within structures that placed other people's authority above his own. The Atomic Research Center offered him something his previous positions had not: sufficient resources, sufficient equipment, and sufficient institutional autonomy to pursue the design project that had been accumulating in his mind for years. He was given his own laboratory space, access to workshops and fabrication facilities, a small budget for materials, and the general understanding that his work on radiation safety and remote manipulation technology was both scientifically valuable and practically important to the center's ongoing research programs. He began with the mechanics. The fundamental engineering problem was one of extension and control, how to create appendages that could reach beyond the human body and perform precise work at a distance while remaining under the direct and responsive command of the person operating them. Mechanical arms of various kinds had existed in industrial settings for decades, large and powerful, and suited to the heavy repetitive work of manufacturing, but nothing of that kind was relevant to laboratory work, which required the opposite qualities: not power and repetition, but delicacy and adaptability. The ability to make small adjustments in response to changing conditions, to feel, in some meaningful sense, what was being handled. The design that Otto developed across years of iteration and refinement was elegant in the way that the best engineering solutions are elegant, which is to say that it looked, once complete, as though it could not have been otherwise, as though the problem had contained the answer within it all along, and the work of the designer had simply been to find it. 4 appendages, each approximately 2 meters in length when fully extended, constructed from a titanium alloy that combined exceptional strength with sufficient flexibility to allow the full range of articulated movement that laboratory work required. Each arm was segmented, capable of bending at multiple points along its length, terminating in a set of 3-fingered gripping mechanisms that could be configured for tasks ranging from the gross manipulation of large objects to work fine enough to handle materials at a scale approaching the surgical. The arms would be worn on a harness, a circular framework of the same titanium alloy fitted around the wearer's midsection at approximately the level of the lower chest, distributing the considerable weight of the apparatus across the torso in a way that would allow extended wear without prohibitive physical strain. The harness was designed to be donned and removed with relative ease, a feature that Otto considered essential to the device's practical utility, since a piece of safety equipment that was difficult or time-consuming to put on would simply not be used, and he was too committed to the intellectual integrity of his solution to allow practical inconvenience to undermine its adoption. But the element of the design that distinguished it most fundamentally from anything that had preceded it, the element that required the most years of work and the most sustained creative effort, and that Otto himself regarded as his most significant contribution, was the control mechanism. The arms were connected to the harness by a system of neural interface technology that Otto developed through a combination of original research and creative synthesis of work being done in adjacent fields of neurophysiology and bioelectric engineering. The interface read the bioelectric signals generated by the wearer's nervous system and translated them, through a processing mechanism of Otto's own design, into directional commands for each of the 4 arms. The practical consequence of this system was that the arms responded to thought, not to spoken commands or to the manipulation of physical controls, but to the same neurological signals that the human brain generates when it intends any physical movement. Learning to operate them was less like learning to use a tool, and more like learning to use a new part of the body, a process of neural adaptation and practiced attention that Otto had anticipated would take weeks, and that in his own case, as the device's first test subject, took considerably less. His nervous system took to the interface with a readiness that surprised even him, as though some part of his neurology had been waiting for exactly this extension of its reach, had always found the 2 arms nature provided insufficient for the scale of work his mind conceived. The first time he wore the completed harness and operated all 4 arms simultaneously, standing alone in his laboratory on a winter evening with the overhead lights buzzing their low consistent note and the rest of the centre quiet around him, was a moment that Otto would return to in memory many times in the years that followed, though the nature of that returning would change as his life changed. The memory accumulating different meanings in different contexts. What he felt in that moment was a completeness, a sense of rightness, that he had not previously associated with any experience outside the act of solving a particularly difficult problem. The arms moved as he intended them to move. They responded with a sensitivity and precision that exceeded his most optimistic projections. He reached with one of them to a shelf across the laboratory and retrieved a glass beaker without disturbing the objects on either side of it, and then held the beaker steady while another arm uncapped a flask, and the whole operation felt from the inside as natural and unremarkable as reaching across a table with his own hand. He stood there for a long time, in that quiet laboratory, 4 extra arms arranged around him in attitudes of readiness, and felt for perhaps the first time in his adult life something that was not the satisfaction of intellectual achievement or the relief of a problem resolved, but something warmer and stranger than either, something that might, in a person with better access to his own emotional life, have been recognized as joy. The harness and its arms became, in the period following their completion, the centerpiece of his professional identity in a way that went beyond their practical utility. He wore them during demonstrations for colleagues and administrators, conducted experiments while operating them, refined and adjusted the design based on the experience of extended use. His publications on the device and its underlying technology attracted the significant attention that his earlier theoretical work had begun to generate, and the response from the scientific community was, for the most part, genuinely admiring. Here was a solution to a real problem, elegantly conceived and carefully executed. The work of a mind that could hold both the engineering and the science in focus simultaneously. His professional reputation reached a kind of peak during these years, and with it came the recognition that had always been the implicit goal of everything he worked toward: invitations to present at major conferences, requests to serve on advisory committees, correspondence from researchers at prestigious institutions who wanted to discuss collaboration. Otto received all of this with the complicated mixture of satisfaction and continued dissatisfaction that characterizes people who have organized their lives around the pursuit of recognition, and who discover, upon receiving it, that it does not feel as complete or as permanent as they had imagined it would. Each acknowledgement was real, each one confirmed something he needed confirmed, and each one faded with time, leaving the hunger for the next one essentially unchanged. It was during this period of professional recognition that Mary Alice Anders entered his life, and it is worth spending a moment with this because it represents one of the few occasions in the record of Otto's life when something other than work and the desire for achievement occupied the foreground of his attention. Mary Alice was a researcher at the centre, not in Otto's immediate field but in adjacent territory, a woman of considerable scientific ability and a directness of manner that he found, initially, more challenging than appealing. She did not adjust her assessments to accommodate his self-regard. She disagreed with him in meetings, clearly and without apparent anxiety about how this would be received. She was interested in his work without being dazzled by it, which was a combination he had almost no experience of and did not quite know how to respond to. What developed between them was gradual and somewhat hesitant on both sides, a series of conversations that extended past their professional subjects, shared meals in the centre's cafeteria that lasted longer than either of them had planned, a quality of mutual attention that slowly accumulated into something that both of them recognized as significant, without quite having words for it yet. For Otto, the experience of being genuinely interested in another person, of finding that the time spent in someone's company produced something other than the mild impatience he generally felt in social situations, was disorienting in a way that he struggled to articulate even to himself. He was not practiced in this. He had never been practiced in this. His mother's response to Mary Alice was immediate and total in its opposition, expressed not through direct confrontation, but through the steady application of the same techniques she had always used, the withdrawal of warmth, the quiet insistence that Otto's destiny was too important to be complicated by ordinary attachments, the gentle but persistent suggestion that Mary Alice, however pleasant, was simply not the kind of person whose life was calibrated to the scale of what Otto was going to become. Mary Lavinia did not forbid the relationship. She did not need to. She simply made clear, in the way she had always made clear things she wanted Otto to understand, that her approval was conditional, and that the condition was the prioritization of his work and his future above all other considerations, including this one. The relationship with Mary Alice ended without dramatic confrontation or clear resolution, dissolving gradually under the accumulated pressure of Otto's withdrawal, his increasing unavailability, his retreat into the laboratory and the harness and the work that his mother had always told him was the true substance of his life. Mary Alice accepted the ending with a dignity that Otto recognised and could not quite meet, and she remained at the centre for some time afterward, their interactions professional and civil and carrying between them the particular weight of something that had been possible and had not been pursued. Otto returned his full attention to his work, and the work was genuinely absorbing, genuinely demanding, genuinely worthy of everything he gave it. The arms were refined further, new applications were explored, the neural interface was improved. He was doing important things, real things, things that mattered in the ways that science matters when it is done well and directed at genuine problems. And yet, in the evenings, in the laboratory after the others had gone home, operating his 4 additional arms in the quiet of a space that was entirely his, he was alone in a way that the work, however absorbing, could not entirely fill, and that he had not yet developed any other means of addressing. The years of refinement that followed the harness's completion had settled Otto into a rhythm that suited him better than any previous arrangement his life had offered. The laboratory was his in a way that felt total and uncomplicated, the one space in the world where his authority was absolute and his judgment uncontested, where the problems presented themselves cleanly, and the solutions, when they came to him alone. He had arranged his existence around this space with the careful attention of someone who understands that the conditions of work are not incidental to the work itself but constitutive of it, that the quality of what a mind produces depends in part on the quality of the environment in which that mind is permitted to operate. The harness had become, in this period, so thoroughly integrated into his daily practice that the distinction between wearing it and not wearing it had begun to feel less significant than it once had. He put it on in the mornings with the same unreflective habit with which another person might put on a coat, and he moved through his working hours with all 4 arms available to him, reaching and adjusting and manipulating with a fluency that his colleagues found remarkable to observe and that he himself had ceased to notice. The neural pathways that had adapted so readily to the interface in those first weeks of testing had continued to develop and deepen over the years of use, and the connection between his intention and the arm's response had achieved a quality of immediacy that made the technology feel less like a tool he operated and more like a part of himself that he had simply not previously had access to. It was in this context, in this period of settled professional productivity and the particular solitude that had become his permanent atmosphere, that the circumstances of the accident began to assemble themselves, not dramatically, not with any of the warning signals that might have allowed a more attentive person to recognize and interrupt the sequence of events before it reached its conclusion. The accident at the Atomic Research Center, on the day that changed everything, assembled itself out of components that were individually unremarkable, a demonstration that had been scheduled weeks in advance, equipment that had been functioning within acceptable parameters, a morning that had begun like any other morning in a laboratory that had seen hundreds of mornings just like it. The demonstration had been arranged for a group of visiting researchers and administrators, people whose continued institutional support was important to the centre's funding and whose understanding of the work being done there was, Otto privately considered, limited but necessary to cultivate. He had conducted demonstrations of this kind before, had shown the harness and its capabilities to various audiences over the years, and had developed a practice sequence of activities designed to illustrate the device's utility without requiring the visitors to possess any specialist knowledge to appreciate what they were seeing. He was not particularly looking forward to it. These performances for non-specialist audiences always struck him as a reduction of something important to something merely impressive. But he had agreed to it, and he would conduct it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. The preparation for the demonstration had been completed the previous evening. The radioactive materials to be handled were prepared and positioned. The monitoring equipment was calibrated. The protective shielding was arranged according to the protocols that Otto himself had helped to develop over years of working with such materials. He had reviewed the safety checklist with the same systematic attention he always brought to such reviews, and nothing in that review had suggested any reason for concern. The equipment was functioning. The materials were within their expected parameters. The shielding was correctly positioned. What the checklist did not capture What no checklist is designed to capture was the accumulated effect of a long period of working at the edge of safety margins, the gradual drift of equipment performance that happens over time when instruments are used intensively and calibrated infrequently, the small discrepancies that are individually below the threshold of concern, and that compound over weeks and months into something considerably more significant. It did not capture the specific combination of factors that would converge on that particular morning, the slight miscalibration of one monitoring instrument, the hairline stress fracture in a containment component that had been there for some time without manifesting in any way that the regular inspections had detected, the particular arrangement of materials that Otto had chosen for the demonstration based on its visual clarity for a non-specialist audience rather than on any consideration of what that specific configuration might mean for the distribution of energy in the event of an uncontrolled release. And it did not capture, though this is the most delicate part of the accounting, the degree to which Otto's own overconfidence in his knowledge of the materials and his faith in the protection afforded by the harness had, over the years, introduced a subtle relaxation into his approach to certain safety protocols, a willingness to work closer to the margins than the formal guidelines specified, a conviction, never consciously articulated but present in his behaviour, that his expertise and his equipment together constituted a level of protection that made the more conservative protocols unnecessarily cautious. The visitors arrived in the mid-morning. There were perhaps a dozen of them, a mixture of researchers from other institutions and administrative personnel from the funding bodies that supported the centre's work. They filed into the laboratory with the slightly uncomfortable alertness of people who are aware that they are in a place where they do not entirely understand what is happening and are doing their best not to show it. Otto greeted them with the contained cordiality that was his version of warmth in professional settings, directed them to positions from which they could observe the demonstration without being in its way, and began. The early stages of the demonstration proceeded exactly as planned. He moved through the sequence with the practiced fluency of someone who has done something many times, showing the arm's range of motion, demonstrating their sensitivity by performing tasks requiring fine dexterity, explaining in language calibrated for a non-specialist audience the principles of the neural interface and the safety advantages it offered over existing remote manipulation approaches. The visitors watched with the attentive interest of people who are genuinely trying to understand something outside their direct experience, and several of them asked questions that Otto answered with a patience he did not entirely feel, but managed to perform adequately. It was in the later stages of the demonstration, when he moved to the handling of the actual radioactive materials that were the practical justification for the device's existence, that the sequence of events began to diverge from what had been planned. The exact sequence is less important than its outcome, and its outcome was an explosion, not a large one by the standards of industrial accidents, not the kind of catastrophic release of energy that unmakes buildings, but sufficient, more than sufficient, to transform the conditions in that laboratory in a matter of seconds. The containment component failed. The monitoring instruments, already slightly miscalibrated, registered the change a moment too late to trigger the automated safety responses. The materials released energy in a pattern that the shielding, positioned for a different configuration, did not adequately intercept. The heat came first, or rather the heat was what registered most immediately, a wave of it that was both instantaneous and, in the memory of those who experienced it, somehow elongated, stretched out in the way that intense physical experience sometimes is. The visitors were far enough from the source that they sustained no serious injuries, shaken and frightened but physically intact, and they were evacuated from the laboratory by the centre's emergency protocols within minutes. Otto was not evacuated. Otto was at the centre of what had happened, and by the time the emergency personnel reached him, he was on the floor of the laboratory, the harness still on his body, the forearms motionless around him, in attitudes that the people who found him would later describe as resembling, in some obscure way, the posture of something protective. The burns were severe across a significant portion of his torso and upper arms, the skin damaged in ways that would require extensive treatment and leave permanent marking. His eyes had been affected by the flash of the initial release, and there was in those first hours a genuine uncertainty about the extent to which his vision had been permanently compromised. His hands, those instruments of the precise laboratory work that had defined his professional identity, had sustained damage that the treating physicians were careful not to characterize too definitively in those early assessments, understanding that the full picture of nerve and tissue damage would only become clear over time, and that premature certainty in either direction served no one. The weeks in hospital were their own kind of experience, distinct from anything Otto had previously known, and they require a moment of quiet attention, because what happened to him there was not only physical. The physical injuries were serious and painful, and required sustained medical attention, but Otto had resources of physical endurance that surprised his medical team, and the burns and the damage to his hands and eyes, while significant, were in most respects addressable by the medicine of the era. What was less easily addressed was the neurological finding that emerged from the more thorough examinations conducted in the second week of his hospitalization. The radiation exposure had done something to the harness's neural interface, or rather it had done something to the relationship between the interface and Otto's nervous system. The connection that had developed over years of use between his neural pathways and the arm's control mechanisms had been, in some sense, that the examining physicians found difficult to characterize with precision, intensified, and made permanent by the energy of the accident. The interface was no longer simply reading bioelectric signals from his nervous system. It had, through some process that the medicine of that era could describe but not fully explain, become integrated into his nervous system in a way that made the arms not simply a responsive tool, but something closer to a genuine extension of his body. The practical consequence of this was that removing the harness would require a surgical intervention of a complexity and risk that no physician was willing to recommend lightly, and that the possibility of removal might, depending on further examination, not be straightforward at all. Otto received this information lying in a hospital bed, his hands bandaged, his vision still uncertain, and considered it with the part of his mind that remained, even in these circumstances, fundamentally analytical. The arms could not be removed. The arms had become, in some neurological sense, part of him. He lay with this for a long time, and the ward around him was quiet in the particular way of hospitals at night. The distant sound of soft footsteps and the low persistent sounds of medical equipment, and the four arms lay beside him in the narrow bed like sleeping companions, and he thought about what this meant for his life, and his work and his understanding of himself. The psychological changes that the radiation had produced were less immediately apparent than the physical ones, and they emerged gradually over the weeks and months that followed the accident, in ways that were visible to the people around him before they were fully visible to Otto himself. The physicians and the centre's personnel who visited him during his hospitalization noticed a sharpening of certain qualities that had always been present in his character, an intensification of the impatience and the certainty and the sense of his own superiority that had always been detectable, but that had been, before the accident, modulated by a degree of professional self-awareness. That modulation seemed, in the aftermath, to have been reduced. He was more direct in his expressions of contempt for assessments he considered inadequate, less willing to perform the courtesies that smooth professional relationships, more openly dismissive of the authority of people whose qualifications he did not respect. The grandiosity that had always been present in his self-conception, the legacy of his mother's insistence on his exceptional destiny, seemed to have been amplified, freed from the constraints that social awareness had previously placed on its expression. He spoke of his own work and his own ideas with a certainty that crossed at times into something that the people around him experienced as discomforting, as though the ordinary rules of epistemic humility did not apply to him because he had moved beyond the territory where they were relevant. Mary Lavinia came to the hospital and sat beside him, and told him that the accident was the world's failure, not his, that the equipment and the people responsible for its maintenance had let him down, that his genius was intact and his destiny unchanged. And Otto listened to this with the complicated mixture of comfort and recognition that his mother's certainty had always produced in him. He knew, in some part of himself, that this accounting was incomplete. He knew that his own choices had been among the factors that assembled the conditions for what had happened. But the part of him that had always needed his mother's version of events to be true needed it no less now than it had in childhood, and he did not contradict her. She died some months after his discharge from hospital, not from any dramatic cause, but from the accumulation of age and ill health that had been building for some time, slipping away in a manner that felt to Otto both sudden and somehow always inevitable. He had not been with her at the moment of it. He had been in the laboratory, because the laboratory was where he always was, where everything else in his life had always eventually resolved to. And the call came from her neighbour in the late afternoon, and he sat for a long time afterward in the quiet of the space that was most fully his own, the four arms still around him, and felt the particular grief of a person who has lost the only relationship in their life that was entirely without reservation. However complicated the terms of that relationship had always been. He did not weep, or rather the record does not suggest that he wept, but the person who came into the laboratory the following morning was, by the accounts of those who knew him well enough to notice, subtly different from the person who'd been there the day before, as though something had been removed that had been providing, without his fully knowing it, a structural support he could not now replace. The months that followed his mother's death and his discharge from hospital were months of a particular kind of deterioration, the kind that does not announce itself as deterioration, but presents instead as a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. Otto returned to the Atomic Research Centre because the laboratory was the only home he had ever truly had, and because the work, whatever else had changed, remained something he understood how to do. He returned with the harness permanently fixed to his body, his hands still carrying the effects of the burns in ways that made certain fine manipulations more difficult than they had been, his eyes behind thicker lenses now, and his psychology altered in ways that were becoming more visible to the people around him with each week that passed. The centre's administration had been patient during his recovery, the patience of an institution that understood his value and was willing to make accommodations that it would not have made for a less significant researcher. But patience of this kind is always conditional, always quietly attached to expectations about what the recipient of the patience will eventually produce in return, and the Otto Octavius who returned to his laboratory was not producing what those expectations had assumed. He was present, he was working, but the work had taken on a quality that his supervisors found difficult to characterize precisely, and therefore difficult to address directly. It was more solitary, more internally directed, less connected to the collaborative and institutionally legible research agenda that justified his position. He was pursuing lines of inquiry that he did not explain to anyone, and that he did not seem interested in explaining. He was dismissive of requests for updates and progress reports in ways that went beyond his previous impatience with administrative process into something that felt, to the people receiving this dismissiveness, like contempt. There were meetings. There are always meetings in institutional life when something is going wrong, and no one quite wants to name what is going wrong. Meetings in which the language of concern and support is deployed to carry the freight of warnings and expectations that politeness will not allow to be stated directly. Otto attended these meetings and responded to their implicit communications with an increasing openness about what he thought of the people delivering them. An openness that was not diplomatic and that did not pretend to be. He told his immediate supervisor during one such meeting that the man's understanding of the research was insufficient to make his opinions about its direction worth attending to. He told an administrator who raised concerns about laboratory access protocols that the protocols in question had been designed for people who needed them, and that he did not. The specific dispute that preceded his first criminal act has the quality, in retrospect, of something that was always going to happen, a confrontation that had been assembling itself in the background of all those smaller meetings and dismissals, and was simply waiting for the right occasion to complete itself. The dispute was ostensibly about the direction of his research, about whether the work he was pursuing aligned sufficiently with the centre's institutional priorities and its obligations to its funding bodies. But the ostensible subject of the dispute was, as the ostensible subjects of such disputes generally are, a vehicle for something else, for the accumulated frustration on both sides of an arrangement that had become untenable, for the collision between an institution's need for legibility and control and a mind that had decided, somewhere in the months since the accident and his mother's death, that the requirement to make itself legible to lesser intelligences was no longer one it was willing to meet. Otto's response to the confrontation was not planned, or at least there is no indication that it was planned in the way that his later schemes would be planned. With the careful systematic attention of someone who has thought through all the implications and prepared for all the contingencies. It emerged rather from the situation itself, from the moment when the administrator across the table from him said something that Otto experienced as an intolerable diminishment, a suggestion that his continued access to the centre's facilities was contingent on his compliance with research guidelines that Otto regarded as beneath the consideration of anyone doing work of genuine significance. The four arms responded before his conscious mind had fully formulated a decision, moving with the autonomous swiftness that the deepened neural integration had made possible, and within a short time Otto Octavius was in control of the laboratory in a way that went considerably beyond the intellectual authority he had always claimed. He held several of the centre's personnel, a small group that included his supervisor and two of the administrators, in a situation that the subsequent news reports would describe as a hostage situation. Though Otto himself would have rejected this characterization as melodramatic and imprecise, he had not intended to harm anyone. He had intended to make clear, in terms that could not be misunderstood or managed away through the polite evasions of institutional process, that his work would continue on his terms, and that the people who had presumed to place conditions on it had fundamentally misunderstood the situation they were in. The arms made this argument with a physical persuasiveness that words had not achieved, and for a period of hours the centre was in the condition that the news reports described. The arrival of Spider-Man was, from Otto's perspective, an intrusion of a specifically irritating kind. He had been aware of the costumed figure who had been operating in New York City for some time, had read the newspaper coverage with the detached interest he brought to most things that did not directly concern his work, and had formed an opinion that was not particularly respectful. A teenager in a costume, from what the coverage suggested, someone whose physical abilities were real enough, but whose significance Otto had categorized, without much reflection, as local and limited. The figure who came through the laboratory window that day confirmed the physical abilities, but introduced a quality that Otto had not accounted for, a quick adaptive intelligence that was visible in the way the young hero moved and responded, an improvisational creativity that Otto recognized, even in the moment of confronting it, as genuinely capable. Their first exchange was brief and strange. From Spider-Man's perspective, disastrous. Otto had years of experience operating the arms and had developed, through that experience and through the deepened neural integration that the accident had produced, a speed and fluency of control that was significantly beyond what an opponent encountering the device for the first time could reasonably anticipate. Spider-Man's enhanced reflexes were remarkable, his agility was genuine, and his willingness to engage an opponent who outweighed him in mechanical terms by a considerable margin reflected a courage that Otto, even in the act of overpowering him, could not entirely dismiss. But courage and agility were not sufficient for this encounter, not without the specific knowledge of how the arms operated and what the effective counter-strategies might be, and Spider-Man did not have that knowledge because no one did, because Otto was the only person who had ever faced the arms from the opposing side and he had designed them. The young hero was expelled from the laboratory in a condition that the later accounts described carefully, emphasizing that his injuries were real but not severe, that his dignity had suffered considerably more than his body, and that the experience of being handled by four mechanical arms operated by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing was one that left a lasting impression. Spider-Man retreated. Otto watched him go with a feeling that was not quite satisfaction and not quite surprise, but something between them, the recognition of an opponent who was genuinely capable and who had simply encountered something he was not yet prepared for. The resolution of the situation at the centre came through law enforcement rather than heroic intervention, a surrounding and a negotiation and an eventual surrender that Otto agreed to not because he felt defeated, but because he had made his point, or believed he had. And because the practical continuation of his work required a degree of institutional cooperation that could not be obtained from a position of open conflict with the authorities. He submitted to arrest with the particular dignity of someone who regards the legal process as an inconvenience rather than a judgment, and the arms were accommodated by the correctional system with a difficulty that reflected how little anyone had anticipated the specific practical challenges of incarcerating someone in his situation. The period of his first imprisonment was shorter than it might have been, a consequence of various legal and medical complexities connected to the permanent nature of the harness, and it was during this period that the story took its next significant turn, because Spider-Man was not done with the encounter in the way that Otto had assumed he was. The young hero was thinking about what had happened, working through the defeat with the same analytical persistence that characterized Otto's own approach to problems, and arriving at conclusions that would change the terms of their next meeting. Otto did not know this during his imprisonment. He was occupied with his own thinking, with plans and calculations and the first beginnings of the more systematic approach to his circumstances that would define his subsequent career, and it did not occur to him that the teenager he had expelled from his laboratory was doing anything similar. He learned otherwise upon his release, in an encounter that had a different quality from their first meeting, the quality of something that had been prepared for, that had taken into account what the first meeting had revealed. Spider-Man had in the interval sought counsel from a source that had provided both practical encouragement and a specific insight into what had gone wrong in the laboratory, what had made the arms so difficult to counter, and what a different approach might accomplish. The Human Torch, whose own experience of unusual physical abilities gave him a relevant perspective, had offered the younger hero something that Otto recognized when the second encounter demonstrated its effects as genuinely useful advice about the psychological as well as the physical dimensions of the contest. The rematch was different. Not dramatically different in terms of the physical capabilities on either side, the arms were still what they had been, and Spider-Man's abilities had not changed in the interval, but the tactical approach that the young hero brought to the second encounter reflected learning in a way that the first encounter had not. He was less predictable, more willing to use the environment in ways that complicated the arm's reach, more attentive to the patterns in Otto's control of the four appendages and more creative in exploiting the brief intervals between their movements. It was still a close contest, still one in which the outcome was genuinely uncertain for a significant portion of its duration, and Otto found, in the midst of it, that his assessment of his opponent was being revised upward in ways he had not anticipated. The defeat, when it came, was not dramatic. It was the outcome of a sustained contest in which Spider-Man's adaptability had gradually accumulated enough advantage to be decisive, and Otto accepted it with the internal accounting of someone who was already thinking about what the defeat means for future encounters rather than dwelling on its immediate experience. He was captured and returned to custody, and the news coverage of his apprehension introduced to the public the name that the press had attached to him during his first encounter with Spider-Man, a name that he had not chosen and that he regarded with a complicated mixture of irritation and, though he would not have admitted this, a faint recognition that it captured something real. Dr. Octopus. It had been coined by someone at a newspaper whose instinct for the arresting image was better than his understanding of the actual situation, but it had spread with the momentum that certain names acquire when they fit their subject closely enough to feel inevitable. The forearms, the scientific credentials, the laboratory setting of his first offence, all of it condensed into two words that were vivid and slightly absurd, and that Otto could not quite shake, partly because every subsequent encounter with Spider-Man and every subsequent news report reinforced them, and partly because they named something that he was becoming in a way that his own name no longer fully captured. He lay in his cell in those first days after the second defeat and thought about Spider-Man with the focused, systematic attention that he brought to any problem that had proven more significant than his initial assessment had suggested. The young hero was more than he had appeared to be, more than the newspaper coverage had conveyed, more than his age and his evident inexperience should have allowed him to be. There was something in the quality of his engagement with the world, something in the way he fought and the reasons he appeared to fight, and the persistence with which he returned after being defeated, that Otto found himself thinking about in terms that went beyond tactical analysis, into something more like genuine curiosity about a phenomenon he did not yet fully understand. He would come to understand it better, across many years and many encounters, but that understanding, when it arrived, would not bring him what he might have hoped from it. It would bring him instead the particular frustration of a mind that has fully comprehended a problem and cannot, despite that comprehension, solve it, a frustration that would become one of the defining textures of his life from this point forward, woven through everything that followed like the low persistent sound of a machine that runs without stopping and without rest. Incarceration, for a mind like Otto's, was not primarily a physical experience. The cell was small, and the days were structured by schedules he had not designed, and the company of people whose intellectual lives bore no resemblance to his own. But none of these conditions constituted the real substance of what imprisonment meant for him. The real substance was the enforced passivity, the requirement to wait, to exist within a situation not of his choosing and not under his control, to be subject to the authority of systems and personnel whose qualifications to exercise that authority he regarded as essentially non-existent. He managed this with a stillness that the correctional staff found more unsettling than agitation would have been, the stillness of someone who is not accepting their situation, but simply processing it, filing it away in a part of the mind reserved for things that will be addressed when the appropriate moment arrives. The arms were with him. As they were always with him now, folded into configurations that the cell could accommodate, their presence a source of both ongoing negotiation with the facility's administration and a kind of private comfort that Otto would not have described in those terms, but that functioned that way nonetheless. They were his, in a sense that nothing else in his current environment was his, and their presence was a continuous reminder that, whatever the law and the correctional system believed they had not contained the most important thing. He thought during these months, with a systematic thoroughness, that the absence of laboratory work actually facilitated in certain respects. Without the absorbing daily demands of experimental science, his mind turned to the larger problem of his situation with a sustained attention it might not otherwise have given it. And the larger problem of his situation, reduced to its essential components, was this. He had engaged Spider-Man twice and had won the first encounter and lost the second, and the margin of the second defeat had been narrow enough to confirm that the contest was genuinely open, that the young hero's victory had not reflected any fundamental superiority, but rather a specific tactical adjustment that Otto had not anticipated. This was useful information. It meant that the problem was soluble. It meant that the defeat was an episode rather than a verdict. But thinking about the problem from inside a cell also led him to a conclusion that he arrived at gradually and with some resistance, because it was a conclusion that required acknowledging a limitation he was not naturally inclined to acknowledge. The limitation was this: Spider-Man was difficult to defeat alone. Not impossible, but difficult. In ways that the two encounters had made clear. The young hero's combination of enhanced physical abilities, tactical creativity, and the particular psychological quality that Otto had found himself contemplating in the aftermath of their second meeting, that quality of inexhaustible recommitment, of returning and returning without apparent diminishment of will, created an adversary who consumed resources faster than a single opponent could replenish them. The solution, when it formed, had the clean simplicity of a well-designed experiment. If one opponent was insufficient, the answer was more opponents. Not simply more opponents in the sense of additional bodies, which would merely multiply the problem of coordination without addressing the underlying challenge, but more opponents of a specific kind, each chosen for abilities that addressed a particular dimension of Spider-Man's defensive repertoire, deployed in a sequence designed to exhaust him progressively before the decisive confrontation. It was, in structural terms, the same kind of systematic problem-solving that Otto brought to any engineering challenge, and it produced in his mind in that cell the same quality of quiet satisfaction that a good experimental design produced, the satisfaction of seeing a complex problem yield to the application of sufficient intelligence. The practical execution of this plan required first his release, which came eventually through the combination of legal processes and the various complications that his unique physical situation continued to create for the institutions responsible for managing it, and then a period of preparation that was in some ways the most interesting part of the entire enterprise. He needed to identify, locate, and approach 6 individuals, himself included, whose combined abilities and motivations could be aligned, at least temporarily, toward the single objective of destroying Spider-Man. Each of these individuals would need to be assessed not only for their practical capabilities, but for their psychological reliability, their willingness to operate within a structure they had not designed, and under a leadership they had not chosen, and their capacity to sustain their commitment to the collective objective through whatever difficulties the operation encountered. The 5 he chose, in addition to himself, were figures whose names were already appearing in the margins of the public record that Spider-Man was generating in those years. Electro, whose ability to generate and control electrical current at lethal intensities gave him capacities that addressed Spider-Man's agility in ways that purely mechanical force could not. The Vulture, an elderly man of surprising ferocity, whose mechanical wings gave him aerial mobility that would complicate the young hero's web-based movement through 3-dimensional space. Mysterio, a former film industry special effects technician whose mastery of illusion, gas-based disorientation, and the psychology of misdirection offered a different kind of threat from the purely physical. Sandman, whose ability to transform his body into a granular substance, gave him a resilience to physical damage that Spider-Man's strength could not straightforwardly address. And Kraven the Hunter, a man of considerable physical capability and extensive experience tracking and confronting dangerous prey, whose professional pride and personal obsession with the challenge of Spider-Man aligned him with Otto's objective as naturally as any of the others. The meetings through which Otto assembled this group were conducted with the care and precision of a scientist designing an experimental apparatus, each element chosen for its specific function, and arranged in relation to the others with attention to how the combination would perform under conditions that the individual components alone could not handle. He approached each of the 5 separately, in settings and through channels that reflected his knowledge of their individual psychologies, and he made to each of them an argument calibrated to what that specific person most needed to hear. To Electro he spoke of the opportunity to settle a score against an opponent who had embarrassed him publicly. To the Vulture he offered the prospect of proving, at a stage of life when others had dismissed him, that his capabilities remained formidable. To Mysterio he extended a professional respect that the man's former career had not provided him. To Sandman and Kraven he presented the challenge itself as sufficient motivation, the chance to be part of something that would resolve, definitively, the question of whether Spider-Man was truly as capable as his reputation suggested. What he did not offer any of them, and what he would not have offered even if it had occurred to him as a potentially effective approach, was genuine partnership. Otto was assembling a tool for a specific purpose, and his relationship to the components of that tool was the relationship of a craftsman to his materials, appreciative of their qualities, attentive to their characteristics, but not confused about the fundamental nature of the arrangement. He would lead. They would follow. The plan was his. The execution would be collective. The credit, when it came, would be distributed in whatever way public perception distributed it, but the intellectual authorship of the enterprise was not something he was willing to share or obscure. The Sinister Six announced themselves to the world and to Spider-Man specifically in the summer of 1964, through a communication that Otto drafted with the same meticulous attention to language and effect that he brought to scientific writing, a document that laid out the terms of the challenge with a clarity that was both genuinely impressive and, in retrospect, revealing of something important about its author's understanding of what he was doing. The communication was addressed to Spider-Man directly, and delivered through channels that would guarantee its publication in the Daily Bugle, whose publisher's interest in the Wallcrawler was by this point well established. It specified the nature of the challenge, the sequential structure through which Spider-Man would be required to face each member of the group individually, and the consequence of his failure to do so, the harm that would come to people he was known to care about. The sequential structure was Otto's most considered strategic contribution to the plan, and it reflected his most careful thinking about Spider-Man's actual capabilities and their limits. The young hero was genuinely formidable. This had been established beyond reasonable doubt by the 2 previous encounters, but formidability had limits, and those limits were most likely to be reached through attrition rather than through any single decisive engagement. By requiring Spider-Man to fight through 5 encounters before reaching Otto, the plan was designed to do what no individual opponent had been able to do, exhaust the extraordinary reserves of physical and psychological endurance that had made their second meeting so unexpectedly difficult. Each of the 5 would take something from him. Otto would face whatever remained. The flaw in this design, the structural weakness that Otto would spend considerable time analysing in the aftermath of its failure, was one that had been present from the beginning, but that his confidence in the plan's essential elegance had led him to underweight. The flaw was that the sequential structure, designed to exhaust Spider-Man progressively, also prevented any member of the group from providing support to any other member at the moment of engagement, which meant that each individual encounter was exactly the kind of one-on-one contest that Spider-Man had already demonstrated he could manage. The design that was supposed to compound the difficulty of each successive fight by depleting the hero's resources had an inverse effect on the group's collective strategic coherence, separating its members at precisely the moments when their combination might have been decisive. There was also, and this was perhaps the more fundamental issue, the matter of what happened when you placed 5 people with powerful abilities, strong egos, and fundamentally incompatible personal styles in a collaborative arrangement that none of them had chosen freely, and all of them experienced as a constraint on their individual preferences. Otto had understood, intellectually, that managing this group would require ongoing attention. What he had underestimated was the degree to which the management problem was not one of logistics, but of psychology. Not a question of coordinating schedules and positions, but of navigating the specific relational dynamics of 5 people who had each, in their own way, arrived at their current situation through a history of operating alone, and who had each, in their own way, developed a relationship with authority that made them poor candidates for straightforward organizational hierarchy. The Vulture's resentment of Otto's leadership was visible from the earliest meetings and never fully resolved. Craven's pride made him genuinely uninterested in the collective objective except in so far as it provided a context for his own performance. Mysterio's relationship with reality, always somewhat elastic, produced in group settings a tendency toward elaboration and self-dramatization that complicated practical planning. Electro was reliable within the narrow parameters of his role, but showed no investment in the broader enterprise. Sandman, perhaps the most straightforwardly cooperative of the 5, was also the least interesting to Otto as an intellectual companion, which meant that the one member of the group who might have been a genuine partner in the strategic thinking was the one Otto was least inclined to engage at that level. Spider-Man moved through the sequential encounters with a quality that was, by any objective standard, remarkable, and that Otto observed from a distance with an attention he had not expected to feel. The young hero was depleted. This was evident by the time he reached the final stages of the sequence, carrying the accumulated physical and psychological cost of the preceding encounters in ways that were visible in his movement and his timing. But he was not broken, and the difference between depleted and broken was, as it turned out, the critical difference for the entire enterprise. A depleted Spider-Man was still Spider-Man, still capable of the adaptive tactical creativity that had characterized their second meeting, still possessed of that quality of inexhaustible recommitment that Otto had identified in his cell, and had designed this entire elaborate apparatus to defeat. Their encounter, when it came, had a quality that Otto would later find difficult to characterize accurately in his own private accounting of it. He had expected to face something diminished. What he faced was something transformed, a Spider-Man whose exhaustion had burned away everything inessential and left something that was, paradoxically, harder to defeat rather than easier. A mind and a body stripped to their most fundamental capacities, and operating from those capacities with a clarity and efficiency that the ordinary complexity of a fresh engagement tended to obscure. The defeat was real, and it was complete, and it was delivered by someone who, by any reasonable prior calculation, should not have had enough left to deliver it. He was captured again. The group dissolved, as groups assembled from such materials under such conditions were always going to dissolve, each member returning to the individual trajectories from which Otto had briefly and unsuccessfully diverted them. The newspapers treated the Sinister Six's failure as either a cautionary tale about the limits of criminal cooperation or a celebration of Spider-Man's extraordinary resilience, depending on the sympathies of the publication, and Otto read the coverage from custody with the focused attention of someone conducting a post-experiment analysis, noting what the data said and revising his models accordingly. What the data said was not reassuring in the simple sense of confirming his prior hypotheses, but it was, in the way that data always is when it is received honestly, genuinely useful. The sequential strategy had failed not because the underlying analysis was wrong, but because the human materials through which it was implemented had properties that his analysis had not adequately weighted. The group had been a sound idea imperfectly executed, not because of external circumstances, but because of his own limitations as a leader of people whose motivations and psychologies he had understood analytically, without understanding them in the deeper way that genuine collaboration requires. He sat with this understanding in the particular quiet of his cell, the arms folded around him, and acknowledged to himself, in the privacy that was the only place such acknowledgments were possible, that the problem of Spider-Man was more significant and more complex than any problem he had previously set himself, and that resolving it would require not just more power or better planning, but something that his entire life had been systematically failing to develop in him. He did not know, sitting there, what that something was. But the question had formed, and in Otto's mind a question once properly formed had a way of eventually producing, through whatever process of thought and experience was required, something that resembled an answer. The years that followed the dissolution of the Sinister Six established a rhythm that would define the middle decades of Otto's career, a pattern of scheme and capture and release and scheme again that had, from the outside, the quality of repetition, but that contained, from the inside, a continuous process of refinement and self-revision that Otto experienced as genuinely progressive even when the external results suggested otherwise. Each encounter with Spider-Man added something to his understanding. Each defeat, received with the systematic attention of someone conducting an ongoing experiment, yielded data that modified the parameters of the next attempt. The losses accumulated, but so did the knowledge, and Otto had always believed with a faith that was as close to religious conviction as his temperament permitted. That sufficient knowledge correctly applied was ultimately decisive. The 1960s unfolded around him in a world that was changing in ways he observed with the detached interest of someone whose primary concerns lay elsewhere. The decade's upheavals, its political convulsions and cultural transformations, and the particular quality of anxiety that attended the space race and the arms race, and all the other races through which the century was expressing its fundamental tensions, registered on Otto primarily as context, as the background against which his more specific and more consuming drama was playing out. He was not indifferent to the world exactly, but his attention had a hierarchy that placed his work and his ongoing contest with Spider-Man at its apex and everything else at a considerable distance below. His schemes during this period had a variety and inventiveness that reflected the genuine quality of his mind even in its increasingly compromised state. He did not repeat himself in any simple way, did not return again and again to the same approaches that had already been demonstrated insufficient. Each new plan showed evidence of the learning that the previous failures had produced, incorporated new elements, addressed vulnerabilities that the earlier attempts had exposed, demonstrated the adaptive intelligence that was, along with the mechanical arms and the neural interface that controlled them, the most formidable thing about him. The plans failed, most of them, because plans of sufficient ambition tend to fail in the face of the specific combination of physical ability and moral commitment that Spider-Man brought to opposing them, but they failed in new ways, which Otto regarded as a form of progress. Spider-Man was changing during these years as well, and Otto observed this change with the attention of someone who understands that the properties of the system one is trying to influence are not static. The teenager who had come through his laboratory window in 1963 was developing into something more substantial and more nuanced with each year that passed, his tactical sophistication deepening, his psychological resources expanding, his understanding of his own capabilities and their limits growing more precise. The defeats he had absorbed in their earliest encounters, including the first decisive one in the laboratory, seemed to have functioned for him the way Otto's defeats functioned for Otto, as data, as information about the distance between current performance and what the situation required, as motivation for the specific kind of growth that was needed. Otto found this genuinely interesting in a way that he would not have predicted in those first years of their antagonism. He had initially categorized Spider-Man as a problem of a straightforward mechanical kind, an obstacle to be overcome through the application of sufficient force and intelligence, and he had expected that once overcome the obstacle would cease to be interesting. What he discovered instead was that the obstacle had a quality that made it persistently interesting regardless of the immediate tactical situation, a quality that he found himself returning to in thought in the spaces between plans and encounters. A quality he did not have a precise word for, but that had something to do with the consistency between what Spider-Man appeared to be and what Spider-Man actually did under pressure. Most people, in Otto's extensive if limited experience of them, revealed a distance between their presented selves and their actual selves when subjected to genuine difficulty. The pressures of real conflict exposed compromises and contradictions that the comfortable social self kept hidden. Spider-Man did not seem to work this way. The qualities that the young hero presented in ordinary circumstances, the commitment to protecting innocent people, the refusal to cause unnecessary harm, the particular quality of humor that accompanied even the most serious engagements, and that Otto had initially dismissed as juvenile and eventually came to recognize as a form of psychological armor and genuine expression simultaneously, these qualities remained consistent under pressures that should, by the ordinary logic of how people respond to extreme stress, have forced some compromise or contradiction into the open. This consistency was, Otto understood, connected to something he had encountered only in the laboratory, in the behavior of physical systems that had achieved a particular kind of internal coherence. Systems of that kind were predictable in the best sense, not in the sense of being easily anticipated in their specific behaviors, but in the sense of having properties that held across widely varying conditions, that could be relied upon to remain what they were regardless of the circumstances in which they were asked to be it. Spider-Man had this quality, and Otto, who had spent his professional life learning to respect the properties of well-designed systems, found it impossible not to extend some version of that respect to the young hero who so infuriatingly continued to defeat him. This respect was not reconciling. It did not soften his determination to overcome Spider-Man or cause him to reconsider the general direction of his career. But it gave his ongoing antagonism a quality that distinguished it from simple hatred or wounded pride, a quality that was more like the relationship between a scientist and a particularly difficult experimental subject, invested and personal and resistant to easy resolution. He thought about Spider-Man in the way that he thought about the hardest problems he had encountered in his scientific career, with a sustained, circling attention that never quite released its grip because the problem had not yet yielded to solution. It was against this backdrop of sustained antagonism and grudging intellectual respect that the encounter with Aunt May Parker occurred, and it is worth approaching this part of the story with the care it deserves, because it represents something in Otto's life that was genuinely unlike anything else in it, something that does not fit neatly into any of the categories through which his story is usually understood. The connection between Otto and May Parker developed through circumstances that had their origins in the particular complications of Peter Parker's dual life, in the way that living as both Spider-Man and a Daily Bugle photographer created situations in which the various elements of his existence sometimes intersected in ways he had not designed and could not easily control. The specific details of how Otto and May first came into sustained contact varied across the tellings, but the essential element was consistent. They met, in the ordinary social sense, as two people who had no particular reason not to meet, an elderly woman of warmth and directness and a man of formidable reputation who was, in her presence, simply a person. May Parker's quality of attention was remarkable in a way that Otto had no existing framework for processing. She did not know who he was in the sense that mattered to his public reputation, or rather she knew the name, but the name did not organize her perception of the man in front of her in the way it organized most people's perceptions. She saw, with the particular perceptiveness of someone who has spent a long life attending carefully to the people around her, a man who was brilliant and lonely and deeply uncomfortable with the ordinary human interactions that her warmth made available to him, and she responded to what she saw with the same uncomplicated generosity she extended to everyone in her life. For Otto, the experience of being in May Parker's company was disorienting in a way that he struggled to account for using the analytical tools that were his primary instrument for making sense of the world. She asked him questions that assumed he was a person of ordinary human dimensions, with ordinary human concerns and feelings, and she listened to his answers with an attention that was not impressed by his intelligence or intimidated by his reputation, but simply genuinely interested in what he was saying. She disagreed with him on small matters with a cheerful directness that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Mary Alice Anders, and she fed him, because feeding people was May Parker's primary language of care, and Otto, who had not been fed by anyone since his mother's death, found this more affecting than he could easily explain. The genuine warmth he felt in her company was not something he examined too directly, because direct examination of feelings was not a practice he had developed over a lifetime of redirecting emotional energy into intellectual activity. But it was real, and it expressed itself in behaviors that the people who observed them from the outside found, depending on their perspective, either touching or absurd. He was gentle with her in a way he was gentle with no one else. He listened to her in a way he listened to almost no one. He made accommodations to her preferences and her pace and her conversational rhythms that would have been entirely foreign to him in any other relationship he had ever had. The dark irony of this situation, the fact that the woman whose company he genuinely valued and in whose presence he felt something approaching the ease that the laboratory usually provided him, was the aunt of the young man who opposed him most persistently and most effectively, was not lost on Otto. He was not unaware of the connection, But awareness and the ability to act on that awareness in ways that would have required him to fundamentally revise his understanding of what he was doing with his life were different things, and the distance between them was, in Otto's case, very large. The courtship, if it can be called that, which extended over a considerable period and culminated in an engagement that represented the single, most unexpected development in Otto's personal life, was characterized by a quality of genuine mutual enjoyment that sits, in the record of his story, like a small warm room in a large cold building. May Parker did not understand Otto's criminal career in its full extent, but she was not unperceptive, and she was not entirely without information, and what she chose to do with the information she had reflected a quality of heart that was all her own, a willingness to see the person rather than the reputation, to respond to what was present in front of her rather than to what the public record described. Peter Parker's experience of this situation was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more extraordinary things that his extraordinary life had required him to process. The man he had fought repeatedly across the better part of a decade, whose schemes had endangered innocent people, and whose mechanical arms had bested him in their first encounter, was sitting in his aunt's living room drinking tea and discussing the merits of different varieties of wheat bread with every evidence of genuine contentment. The restraint required of him in these circumstances, the requirement to behave as Peter Parker, the ordinary young man, rather than as Spider-Man, the recurring adversary of the person, now being offered another biscuit by his aunt, represented a kind of ongoing performance that demanded things of him that most of his battles had not. He managed it with the particular quality of strained composure that the situation required, navigating the conversations and the shared meals and the occasional encounters at his aunt's home with a careful attention to the maintenance of his ordinary persona that left him exhausted in a way that physical combat generally did not. What made it bearable, he told himself, was the observable fact that May Parker was genuinely happy. That Otto's presence in her life had produced in her a brightening that Peter could see clearly and could not entirely resent, even given everything he knew about the person responsible for it. The engagement between Otto and May Parker was real, announced and proceeding, and the precise manner of its dissolution involved the kind of circumstances that reflected how thoroughly Otto's criminal career and his personal life had become entangled in ways neither he nor May had been able to fully anticipate or prevent. When the situation resolved, when the engagement ended without becoming the marriage that Otto's careful attentiveness to May's preferences had been directed toward, the loss was registered differently on different sides of it. For May, there was confusion and sadness, and the particular quality of disappointment that comes when something unexpectedly good turns out to be more complicated than it appeared. For Otto, there was something he did not look at directly, but that functioned in the background of his subsequent activities as a kind of permanent low note, a sustained awareness of something that had been possible and had not been achieved. The irony that Spider-Man had ultimately been the proximate cause of the engagement's failure, that the young hero, who was also the nephew of the woman Otto had come closest to genuinely loving, was the instrument through which that closeness had been broken, was not an irony that Otto experienced as comedic in any register. He filed it away in the part of his mind that held the accounting of what had been lost, alongside his mother's death and Mary Alice Anders and the career that the accident had redirected, and he returned, as he always returned, to the work and the plans and the ongoing problem that his life had organized itself around. The later years of the decade found him pursuing schemes of increasing technical sophistication that reflected both his genuine scientific progress and the accumulated learning of years of engagement with Spider-Man and with the practical realities of criminal enterprise. His understanding of his own capabilities had deepened significantly through the sustained experience of using them, and his understanding of Spider-Man's capabilities had deepened equally through the sustained experience of opposing them. The portrait that was forming across these years was one of the most intimate and complex relationships in Spider-Man's rogues gallery, not intimate in any conventional sense, but in the specific sense of two minds that had come to know each other through conflict with a thoroughness that most relationships achieved only through cooperation. Otto did not think of it in these terms, or at least he would not have used these terms if asked. But in the private hours of his laboratory, in the quiet of cells and the industrious quiet of planning, and the strangely companionable quiet of simply thinking about the problem that Spider-Man represented, there was something present that was not entirely unlike what most people would recognize as a relationship, something that had accumulated through years of sustained mutual attention into a connection that defined, for both participants, a significant portion of what their lives meant and required of them. The decade closed with Otto no closer to the resolution he sought, and no less committed to seeking it. His mind still engaged with the problem in all its dimensions, his arms still folded around him in whatever space the current moment provided, his plans still forming and reforming in the background of everything else. Patient and systematic and entirely characteristic of the man he had become, for better and for worse, and for all the complicated territory between those two poles that most of his story actually occupied. The plans that formed in the closing years of the 1960s had a different quality from what had come before, and the difference was not simply a matter of scale, though scale was part of it, but of architecture, of the underlying structural thinking that shaped how an objective was conceived and pursued. Otto had spent years operating in a mode that was, in retrospect, too direct, too legible, too organized around the assumption that the most powerful approach was the most confrontational one, that the path to defeating Spider-Man ran through engagements in which his superiority was demonstrated openly and conclusively. The results of this approach had been consistent enough to constitute a verdict, and Otto, whatever his other limitations, was capable of reading a verdict when the data presented it clearly enough. The new approach that emerged from this reconsideration was built on a different premise entirely, one that drew on aspects of his scientific training that his criminal career had not previously utilized. The best experiments, Otto knew from his laboratory years, were not the ones that announced their hypotheses in advance and invited the experimental subject to prepare a response. The best experiments were the ones in which the subject was unaware of being studied, in which the conditions of observation were established without the subject's knowledge and the data collected before any defensive response could be organized. Control, in experimental design, came not from force but from concealment, not from the open assertion of superiority but from the patient management of information, from knowing more than your subject knew, and using that asymmetry to shape the conditions of the encounter before the encounter began. The identity of the master planner was Otto's most sustained exercise in this principle, and it was, considered purely as an exercise in concealment and organizational design, one of the genuine accomplishments of his career. He built the enterprise from the ground up, establishing himself as a figure entirely distinct from Dr. Octopus in the understanding of everyone involved, recruiting personnel through intermediaries who knew only what they needed to know to perform their specific functions, establishing the underwater laboratory facility that served as his operational base with a patience and attention to detail that reflected how seriously he was taking the new approach. The facility itself was a considerable engineering achievement, constructed in stages over a period of months, equipped with research capabilities that were legitimate and sophisticated and that Otto used, in the intervals between the criminal operations that funded and justified its existence, for work that was genuinely scientifically interesting. The specific focus of the master planner's criminal operations, the systematic theft of experimental radioactive isotopes and advanced atomic research materials from laboratories and research institutions throughout the region, reflected the same quality of mind that had designed the mechanical arms years earlier, the instinct to identify a resource that others possessed and that he needed, and to acquire it through the most direct available means regardless of the legal status of that means. The isotopes had value both as raw materials for his own research and as commodities that could be exchanged for the funding and personnel that the broader operation required. He approached the logistics of their acquisition with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to any experimental design, mapping the target institutions, identifying the vulnerabilities in their security, planning the specific operations with enough redundancy to accommodate the inevitable variability of real-world execution. The scientific work he conducted with the acquired materials was real, and produced results that, under different circumstances, he might have published. He was, even in this phase of his life, even with all the psychological changes and the narrowing of his concerns into the consuming contest with Spider-Man and the pursuit of the recognition that had always motivated him, still a scientist in some fundamental sense, still capable of the kind of careful, patient experimental work that had defined his legitimate career. The laboratory in the underwater facility had a quality during these months that was not entirely unlike the quality of his best years at the Atomic Research Center, a quality of purposeful absorption in genuine problems, and it is possible that some part of him recognized this and found in it something he had not known he was missing. The circumstances that brought Spider-Man into conflict with the Master Planner arose from a direction that Otto had not anticipated in his planning, because it arose from the personal life of Peter Parker, rather than from any investigative process directed at the Master Planner's operations. Aunt May had fallen ill, her condition serious enough to require medical intervention of a specific and urgent kind, and the treatment that offered the best prospect of her recovery required a radioactive isotope that was, through the particular cruelty of coincidence that shapes so many of the most significant moments in these stories, one of the isotopes that Otto had stolen. Peter Parker, working through legitimate channels with the desperate energy of someone for whom time is the most pressing constraint, was attempting to locate the required material through every available avenue, while simultaneously pursuing as Spider-Man the criminal organization responsible for its disappearance. Otto became aware of this situation gradually, as the Master Planner's intelligence resources reported on the intensifying investigation into the theft of the isotopes, and the awareness produced in him a response that was more complex than simple tactical concern. He knew, through the years of accumulated intelligence about Spider-Man's personal life that his sustained attention to his adversary had generated, that May Parker was important to Peter Parker in ways that went beyond ordinary family affection, that she represented for the young hero a connection to the moral foundation of his identity, a living embodiment of the values that Uncle Ben's death had crystallized into the commitments that drove him. To hold, through the simple accident of possessing something that Spider-Man desperately needed, a leverage of this particular kind over his most persistent adversary was a situation that Otto's tactical mind found immediately significant. He did not, in this period, connect his own feelings about May Parker to the tactical assessment of her significance to Spider-Man. He kept these two understandings in separate compartments, as he kept many things in separate compartments, and the compartmentalization served its usual function of allowing him to proceed with the clarity that direct emotional engagement would have complicated. He made preparations, he waited. He understood that Spider-Man would come, and he organized the facility and its personnel for that eventuality with the thoroughness that the situation warranted. The infiltration of the underwater facility by Spider-Man when it came was not the careful, methodical approach that Otto had anticipated, but something more desperate and more direct, the approach of someone operating under time pressure that overrode the caution that better circumstances would have recommended. Peter Parker knew that his aunt was dying and that the thing required to prevent her death was somewhere in this facility, and this knowledge compressed his decision-making in ways that made him simultaneously more dangerous and more vulnerable than he would otherwise have been. More dangerous because desperation removes certain inhibitions that ordinary caution maintains. More vulnerable because desperation also removes the patience that allows for adaptive response to unexpected developments. The battle in the underwater facility was, by the standards of their encounters across the decade, an unusual one, conducted in an environment that was as much Otto's domain as the laboratory of the Atomic Research Center had been in their first meeting, and that offered him tactical advantages of a different kind from those available in open urban settings. The confined corridors and interconnected chambers of the underwater base suited the arms in ways that open spaces did not, providing surfaces and structural elements that Otto could use as leverage points and obstacles in ways that Spider-Man's web-based mobility could not as easily compensate for. He pressed these advantages with the systematic efficiency that the facility's design had been partly intended to enable. Spider-Man fought with the quality that Otto had come to recognize across their many years of engagement as the most reliable feature of his adversary's performance under extreme conditions, a quality that intensified rather than diminished as the physical and psychological pressures of the encounter accumulated. The exhaustion was visible. The cost of fighting through the facility's personnel and defenses before reaching this final confrontation was written in his movement and his timing, but the essential thing remained, the commitment that did not calculate its own sustainability, the willingness to continue that did not appear to require the prospect of success as a precondition. The damage to the facility's structure occurred as a consequence of the battle, rather than as a deliberate tactic of either participant, the inevitable result of significant force applied in a confined space with complex engineering dependencies. The structural failures cascaded in ways that neither Otto's design nor Spider-Man's combat approach had accounted for, and the collapse that followed was sudden enough and comprehensive enough to change the nature of the situation entirely, transforming a battle between two adversaries into a crisis of survival, in which the isotope and the outcome of the larger contest became secondary to the immediate physical reality of tons of metal and water pressing downward on whatever remained of the facility's structural integrity. Otto was not present for what happened next, having been separated from Spider-Man by the collapse in a way that removed him from direct observation of the sequence that would become, in the subsequent years, one of the most discussed moments in the Wallcrawler's history. What he learned afterward, through the accounts that emerged in the press and through his own subsequent analysis of the physical evidence, was that Spider-Man had been trapped beneath the wreckage of the facility's machinery in a situation that, by any reasonable physical assessment, should have been conclusive. The weight involved was not weight that a human body, even one enhanced by the proportional strength of a spider, should have been able to move from below in a confined space, with the water rising and the structural integrity of the surrounding material continuing to fail. And yet he had moved it. The accounts were consistent on this point, and the physical evidence, examined later by people with the relevant expertise, confirmed what the accounts described. Spider-Man had lifted machinery that should not have been liftable from that position under those conditions, and he had retrieved the isotope from the wreckage, and he had escaped the facility before its final collapse, and he had delivered the material to the medical team treating May Parker in time for it to be useful. The mechanism through which an extraordinary physical feat had been accomplished by someone who had already been pushed beyond his ordinary limits was something that the coverage did not fully explain, because the mechanism was not physical in any simple sense, but was something that the physical sciences that Otto had spent his life studying did not have adequate language for. Otto thought about this for a long time afterward, in the conditions of the custody to which he was returned following his own extraction from the facility's wreckage. He thought about it with the focused, systematic attention he brought to any experimental result that contradicted his prior models, and he arrived at an understanding that was, in its way, as significant as any understanding his scientific career had produced, though it was an understanding about something that his scientific training had not been designed to address. What had moved the machinery was not physical strength in the ordinary sense, or not physical strength alone. It was something that operated through physical strength and expressed itself as physical capability, but that was not reducible to the mechanical properties of muscle and bone and whatever enhancements the spider's bite had introduced into Peter Parker's biology. It was, Otto concluded in the privacy of his own analysis, something that his entire life and all of his considerable intelligence had not equipped him to generate. It was the force that moves through a person when the thing they are fighting for is not themselves, not their ambitions or their pride or their accumulated grievances or their need for recognition, but someone else, someone whose existence matters to them in a way that is prior to and independent of any calculation about what that mattering costs. May Parker was dying, and Peter Parker would not allow it, and in that refusal was a force that Otto's mechanical arms, for all their titanium strength and neural precision and years of refinement, had no equivalent of and no answer for. He had designed the Master Planner operation as his most sophisticated attempt to defeat Spider-Man, and it had instead produced the most clarifying demonstration yet of why those attempts kept failing. The sophistication of the plan, the elegance of the concealment, the genuine scientific accomplishment of the facility and its research, all of it had been insufficient not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed to defeat something that could not be defeated through the application of greater intelligence or more carefully organized force. What Spider-Man had lifted in that flooded basement was not machinery. It was the question of what a person is capable of when they are acting from something that lies beyond the reach of tactical planning, and Otto, for all his brilliance, had no framework for addressing that question that had not already been answered by the person who had just demonstrated its full dimensions to him in the wreckage of his most ambitious enterprise. He was returned to custody. The isotope reached May Parker. The Master Planner ceased to exist as an operational entity, his personnel scattered, his facility destroyed, his concealment definitively broken. And Otto sat in the quiet of his cell and thought about what he had learned, and about how a mind as capable as his had still not found a way to account for the most important variable in the system he was trying to understand. The variable that was not mechanical or chemical or organizational, but was something else entirely, something that Spider-Man seemed to possess in inexhaustible supply, and that Otto, examining his own interior landscape with the honesty that solitude sometimes makes unavoidable, was not certain he had ever possessed at all. There is a particular kind of understanding that arrives not through any single insight or dramatic moment of revelation, but through the slow accumulation of evidence across years, the gradual clarification of a picture that has been forming in the background of everything else, becoming visible only when enough of its components have assembled themselves into a pattern that the observing mind can finally recognize as a whole. The understanding that Otto Octavius had arrived at in the wreckage of the Master Planner Enterprise, sitting in the quiet of custody with the forearms folded around him and the full accounting of another failure available for examination, was this kind of understanding. It had been forming for years. The flooded basement of the underwater facility had simply provided the final piece that made the pattern legible. What the pattern showed was something that Otto had resisted seeing, not through any conscious act of avoidance, but through the more fundamental resistance of a person whose entire self-conception is organized around a set of beliefs that the pattern, if fully acknowledged, would require him to revise. The belief most directly challenged was the one that had sustained him since childhood, since the years of his father's contempt and his mother's compensatory certainty, the belief that intelligence was the sovereign faculty, the one that determined outcomes, the one whose superiority, if sufficiently demonstrated, would eventually resolve all questions in favor of its possessor. Otto had built everything on this belief. His career, his identity, his understanding of his place in the world, all of it rested on the proposition that being the most intelligent person in any situation was, ultimately, the thing that mattered most. Spider-Man kept disproving this proposition, and the manner of the disproving was, on each occasion, more instructive than the last. This was what the accumulated data of their encounters showed, stripped of the tactical details and the specific circumstances of each individual engagement and reduced to its essential pattern. Otto was, by any reasonable assessment, more intelligent than Spider-Man in the narrow technical sense. His planning was more sophisticated, his scientific knowledge was deeper, his analytical capability was greater, and yet Spider-Man kept winning. Not always, not easily, not without cost, but with a consistency that the intelligence hypothesis could not account for. Something else was operating. Something that Otto's analytical framework, constructed around the centrality of intelligence, did not have a category for. It is worth sitting with this recognition for a moment, because it represents one of the most genuinely difficult things that a person of Otto's psychological construction can experience. The discovery that the instrument you have relied on absolutely is not sufficient for the situation you are in is difficult for anyone. For someone whose entire identity is organized around their possession, an exercise of that instrument, it is something approaching an existential crisis, a challenge not just to a strategy or a plan, but to the fundamental story a person tells about who they are and why that matters. Otto did not collapse under this recognition, because collapsing was not in his repertoire, but he was altered by it in ways that continued to work through his psychology long after the immediate analysis was complete. The question of what had formed Otto Octavius, what combination of experience and inheritance and circumstance had produced the specific person now sitting with this understanding in this cell, was one that he had never been inclined to pursue with any directness. Self-examination of the psychological kind, the turning of analytical attention inward onto the processes and histories that shaped behavior, rather than outward onto the problems of the material world, was not a practice he had cultivated. But the situation in which he now found himself, the recognition that the tool he had always used was insufficient for the task he had set it, created a pressure toward exactly this kind of examination that his usual strategies of avoidance could not entirely resist. Talbot Octavius had given his son, among other things, a template for what strength looked like that was defined entirely by what it excluded. Strength, in Talbot's accounting, was the absence of vulnerability, the refusal of softness, the capacity to impose one's will on the material world without being deflected by sentiment or uncertainty, or the needs of others. It was a definition of strength that was really a definition of invulnerability, and it had the particular quality of all such definitions, which is that it was organised around fear, around the terror of what might happen if the armour were removed, if the vulnerability it concealed were exposed to the judgment of people who thought about strength the way Talbot did. Otto had absorbed this template without question, in the years when he had no framework for questioning it, in the years when his father's version of reality was the only version available to him, and it had shaped his psychology in ways that no subsequent experience had been able to fully revise. His mother's intervention had not corrected the fundamental problem, but had layered a different set of distortions over it. Mary Lavinia's insistence on Otto's exceptional destiny had given him a counter-narrative to his father's contempt, a story in which his sensitivity and his intellectual absorption were not weaknesses but marks of a superiority that ordinary people could not recognize because they lacked the faculties required to perceive it. This was more comfortable than his father's version, and it was in certain respects more accurate, because Otto was genuinely exceptional in the specific ways his mother identified. But it was organised around the same underlying structure as his father's template, the same refusal of ordinary human vulnerability, the same insistence that the person who possessed these particular qualities was exempt from the common human condition, with its dependencies and its needs, and its exposure to loss. The two templates together had produced a man who understood the world primarily as a field in which intelligence was exercised and superiority demonstrated, and who had organised his emotional life, insofar as he had an emotional life, around the avoidance of precisely the kinds of vulnerability that the basement of the Master Planner's facility had just demonstrated were the source of Spider-Man's most extraordinary capacities. The strength that had lifted that machinery was not the strength of invulnerability. It was the strength of the person who has something to lose and will not allow it to be lost. The strength of love operating through a body that has been pushed beyond its calculated limits and keeps going, because the calculation is not what is driving it. Otto had nothing equivalent to this. He had never permitted himself anything equivalent to this. His mother's love, the closest thing to unconditional attachment he had experienced, had been organised around her investment in his exceptionalism rather than in him as an ordinary human being with ordinary human needs, and its loss had left him without any model for what it might feel like to be valued simply for existing rather than for performing. Mary Alice Anders had offered something that might have developed into a different kind of connection, but he had retreated from it under pressure before it could develop into anything sturdy enough to sustain the weight he would eventually have needed to place on it. May Parker's warmth had reached him in ways he had not expected, and had not known how to hold on to when the circumstances of his life made holding on to it too complicated. The arms were part of this accounting in a way that required honest examination. He had always understood them as an extension of his intelligence, the most direct physical expression of his mind's reach into the material world, the embodiment of the proposition that a sufficiently capable intellect could extend its influence without limit through the right application of technology and design. This was true as far as it went. But sitting with the question of what the arms had meant to his life with more honesty than he usually brought to the subject, Otto could also see them as something else, as the most visible expression of a psychology organised around the expansion of the self rather than its connection to others, around the accumulation of capability and reach rather than the development of the kind of presence to another person that genuine relationship requires. 4 additional arms represented in purely functional terms the capacity to do more, to reach further, to manipulate more of the material world simultaneously. They did not represent, and had never been designed to represent, any enhancement of the capacity to receive, to be affected, to allow the world and its people to reach back. The arms were perfectly expressive of Otto's character in this sense, magnificently capable in all the directions that his psychology privileged, and entirely silent in the directions that his psychology had closed off. They could extend his reach to the farthest corner of any room he stood in. They could not close the distance between him and another person in any of the ways that actually matter. The radiation's effect on his psychology was a dimension of his story that resisted simple accounting, because the honest answer to the question of what the accident had changed was that it had intensified and clarified rather than fundamentally altered what was already present. The qualities that Dr. Octopus expressed with increasing openness, the grandiosity, the contempt for those he regarded as lesser, the absolute certainty of his own judgment, the willingness to cause harm in pursuit of his objectives, the difficulty with any limit placed on his autonomy, these were not new qualities introduced by the accident. They were existing qualities from which the accident had removed the inhibitory structures that social awareness and professional necessity had previously maintained. The accident had not made Otto Octavius a different person. It had made him more completely himself, in the way that removing a filter makes a signal more completely itself, amplifying not just the content but the noise. This is perhaps the most genuinely tragic dimension of his story, more tragic than the loss of his legitimate career, or the failure of his criminal enterprises, or even the missed opportunities for human connection that punctuate his biography. The tragedy is that the person Dr. Octopus became was always potential in Otto Octavius, always present in the structure of his psychology, waiting for the circumstances that would remove the constraints that kept it from full expression. The accident provided those circumstances, but it did not create the content. The content was there from the beginning, formed in a household in Schenectady, by a father who taught him that vulnerability was contemptible, and a mother who taught him that ordinary human limitations did not apply to him, refined through years of solitary study and social isolation, and the accumulated experience of a person who has always related to the world, primarily through the exercise of his own intelligence rather than through genuine engagement with the intelligence and worth of others. The capacity for genuine feeling that existed in Otto, because it did exist, because the warmth he showed May Parker was real, and the pride he took in genuine scientific accomplishment was real, and the complex respect he'd developed for Spider-Man across their years of antagonism was real. This capacity had never been given conditions in which it could develop into anything robust or sustaining. It was present the way a plant is present when it has had insufficient light, alive but diminished, capable of growth that the conditions have never permitted. His mother had given him something that looked like unconditional love, but was actually conditional on his exceptionalism. His father had given him something that looked like honesty, but was actually contempt. The world of his peers had given him something that looked like respect, but was actually a cautious distance maintained by people who sensed, correctly, that genuine closeness with Otto Octavius was likely to be complicated. What he had never been given, and what his psychology as it had developed made it increasingly difficult for him to seek, was the experience of being genuinely known by another person, and valued in that knowing, not for his intelligence or his accomplishments or the fearfulness of his mechanical arms, but simply for whatever it was that existed at the centre of his life, beneath all the armour and the ambition and the accumulated defences of a person who had decided very early that the world was a place in which the only safe posture was one of superior self-sufficiency. This was the gap at the heart of Dr. Octopus, the absence around which everything else in his life had organised itself, and it was also, when examined with sufficient honesty, the explanation for why his intelligence, for all its genuine power, kept failing to produce the outcomes it should have been capable of producing. Spider-Man kept winning because Spider-Man was fighting for something that existed outside himself, because the force that drove him came from his connections to other people, rather than from his own will to dominance and recognition. Otto kept losing, not always and not easily, but in the pattern that mattered, because the force that drove him was ultimately circular, pointed back at itself, organised around the demonstration of his own superiority to a world that he had never truly joined, and that he had therefore never given any reason to acknowledge what he was trying to demonstrate. The arms lay still around him in the quiet of the cell, and the question that the master planner's failure had finally made unavoidable settled into the background of his thinking where it would remain, not resolved, not acted upon in any of the ways that resolution might have made possible, but present, a permanent addition to the internal landscape of a man who knew more about the physical world than almost anyone alive, and who understood himself, in the deepest and most consequential sense, hardly at all. And so we rest here, at the edge of understanding, in the quiet that follows a long and careful journey through a life that contained, in equal and inseparable measure, genuine brilliance and genuine loss. Otto Octavius asked, across all the decades of his story, the question that most of us ask in one form or another, the question of whether what we are capable of is enough, whether the gifts we possess will finally, if applied with sufficient force and intelligence, produce the recognition and the peace that we have always been moving toward. His answer was the one the universe tends to give to that particular question, which is that the gifts are never quite the point. that what we are capable of means very little apart from what we are willing to feel and who we are willing to feel it for. If this channel has been a companion to your evenings, a gentle place to rest while stories carry you towards sleep, we would be glad to remain so. Subscribing keeps these quiet journeys arriving, one story at a time, told with care for the hours when the mind is ready to let go. Let the arms be still now. Let the laboratory go dark. Let the long thinking rest. You have followed something complex and human all the way to its quietest room, and that is enough. Sleep well.